A medieval moment. Tournaments. Probably no other image conjures up a romantic notion of the Middle Ages more than a tournament or joust. However, tournaments were not always the well-regulated sport of pomp and chivalric exhibition they later became. Tournaments most likely originated as combat training in late 11th century France, when the tactic of charging as a coordinated unit first began. This new tactic of charging with couched lances stuck lightly under the arm rather than used like a spear or thrown overarm, required regular training. The boundary for a tournament was usually unmarked, and though the chief weapons were the lance and the sword, there were actually no weapons restrictions. All was fair in a tournament, including ambushes and other clever tactics. Even foot soldiers had a role to play, as a group of knights could hide behind their men-at-arms until they were ready to charge. As in war, if you lost, you would also forfeit your horse and armor. Thus, the tournaments of this early period were hazardous and bloody, hardly distinguishable from actual combat. As such, the Church made repeated efforts to ban tournaments as too violent and dangerous. In 1130, the Council of Clermont decreed that, quote, "We firmly prohibit those detestable markets or fairs at which knights are accustomed to meet to show off their strength and their boldness," unquote. William Marshall was the jousting superstar of 12th century England. According to historians Danny Danziger and John Gillingham, when William Marshall was on his deathbed in 1219, he was told by a priest that he would get to heaven only if he restored all his ill-gotten tournament winnings. The old warrior, he was now in his 70s, retorted that that was impossible. Quote, "If because of this the kingdom of heaven is closed to me, I can do nothing about it, for I can't return those things. I can only commend myself to God, repenting my sins. Unless the clergy want my damnation, they can ask for no more than that. But their teaching must be false, or else no one would be saved," unquote. However, tournaments simply proved too popular, with the tournament reportedly being held once a fortnight on the continent by the late 12th century. Kings like the English Richard I the Lionheart were avid jousters. The Lionheart abolished the ban on tournaments decreed by his father, Henry II. Richard's much later successor, Henry VIII, was also an avid jouster. By the end of the 12th century, tournaments were being glorified in chivalric literature. They were literally the sport of kings and were as popular then as baseball or football are today. It was in the 13th century, however, that tournaments became more ceremonial and regulated, as lists or enclosed spaces became common. Also, leather armor was often worn, and blunted weapons made of whalebone were used, and the joust, or tilt, specifically single combats, though a knight might be part of a team, became popular. From 1250 onwards, the challenger was allowed to choose whether the joust would be à plaisance, a joust of peace with blunted lances, or à outrance, a joust of war with sharpened lances. Opponents charged each other from opposite ends of the field, with couched lances held at an angle, the aim being to unseat one's opponent. Prizes were awarded by noble ladies, who commonly bestowed kisses or rings, as well as bestowing favors to the knights, who carried them or wore them into combat, with a knight's victory dedicated to the lady whose favor he carried. By the end of the 12th century, judges and heralds began to make an appearance at tournaments to help keep score and maintain order. Heralds also began to record and regulate the use of coats of arms, which first appeared in Europe in the late 12th century as a quick and easy way to recognize knights under their armor. In England in 1484, a College of Arms, which exists to this day, was created by King Richard III so that English heralds could more easily register, record, and regulate the use of coats of arms. The official, or referee at a tournament, was known as the Marshal of the List, who carried a white arrow. If he threw the arrow down, it was a signal for the combatants to cease fighting. Besides the tilt or joust, tournaments also included foot combat, in which the knights initially wore their field harness as if for actual battle, and in which any weapons were allowed, with the poleaxe being a favorite. Such combats were typically fought in an enclosure called in French a champ clos, over a wooden barrier separating the contestants. In such cases, leg armor wasn't required. A general melee or foot combat involving teams of knights was a popular way to end a tournament. Here we see English knight Sir Geoffrey Luttrell being armed for a tournament by his wife and daughter-in-law from the 14th century Luttrell Psalter. In the image on the left, we see preparations for a French tournament of circa the 1350s. In the image on the right, we see French knight Jacques de Lalaing arriving at a tournament with the Counts of Maine and St. Paul in 1530. By the 15th century, a distinctive form of tournament called a pas d'armes became popular, in which an individual knight or team of knights defended an area from opponents, which spectacles often included staging, acting, and a plot based upon a chivalric romance. With the gradual move to plate armor by the late 14th century, special heavier harnesses of jousting armor were being worn. Also, in Italy in 1420, a tilt barrier, or wooden fence running the length of the list and separating the jousters, was added. By this time, jousting had evolved into a purely spectator sport, with points being awarded for the number of pieces your lance splintered into when it made contact with your opponent, whether you hit his shield, etc. In this slide, we see an illumination of a tournament of circa 1472. Note the wooden tilt barrier in the center of the course. In these next two slides, we'll see some of the arms and weapons of medieval knights from the collection of the Royal Armories in Great Britain. In a kind of nostalgia for the good old days of chivalry, tournaments continued in Europe through the reigns of Henry VIII, who was almost killed on one occasion in 1524, all the way into the reign of his daughter Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 till 1603, long after knighthood had died out. An avid jouster, Henry had several harnesses of custom-made tournament armor, some given to him as gifts. Suggested by his chief advisor, Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's most famous and lavish tournament was held on the continent at the English-held city of Calais at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in June of 1520, in which Henry and his knights jousted against the King of France and his knights. The name comes from the fact that the tents and pavilions were made with real cloth of gold, filaments of gold sewn with silk to make the fabric. England and France were long and bitter rivals, yet Henry needed to ally himself with either Francis I or Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, as they were the two most powerful monarchs at the time. Thus the Field of the Cloth of Gold was a kind of summit between Henry and Francis to decide the issue. It nearly bankrupted the treasuries of both realms, as each tried to outdo the other, and ended with Henry allying himself with Charles and the Holy Roman Empire after French King Francis bested the young King Henry in a wrestling match. The Holy Roman Empire then declared war on France, which Henry was obliged to support. This has been a Medieval Moment with Lee Freeman. For more information on a variety of medieval topics, check out Medieval Speak, a medieval word book by Lee Freeman.